When the Netflix documentary focusing on Sean Diddy Combs dropped, most people expected controversy. What few expected were how fast the reactions would spiral once voices from inside Diddy's former inner circle started responding publicly. Among those voices was Roger Bonds, a former bodyguard who claimed first-hand knowledge of how Diddy operated behind closed doors. His reaction to the documentary immediately drew attention, not just because of what he said, but because of who responded next. 50 Cent. And with that response, the situation moved from documentary fallout into full-scale hip-hop confrontation. For years, 50 Cent and Diddy have had a tense relationship, marked by public shots, sarcastic commentary, and long-standing distrust. When news broke that 50 Cent was executive producing a Netflix documentary examining allegations and accusations surrounding Diddy, many assumed personal motives were involved. 50 Cent didn't deny their history, but he pushed back on the idea that the project was about revenge. According to him, the documentary was about accountability, about documenting what had already been alleged publicly, and about letting people who were once silent speak without fear. That framing became more important once Roger Bonds entered the conversation. Roger Bonds wasn't a fan reacting online. He wasn't a rival artist or blogger. He was someone who worked close to Diddy for years, responsible for security and protection, with access to private spaces and real-life situations. When Bond reacted to the documentary, he didn't dismiss it as exaggerated or unfair. Instead, his reaction suggested that what was being shown aligned with what he claimed to have seen firsthand. That response shifted the weight of the conversation. Suddenly, this wasn't just accusers versus a music mogul. It was someone from inside Diddy's operation acknowledging disturbing patterns. Once those comments circulated, attention turned to 50 Cent. As both executive producer of the documentary and one of Diddy's most vocal critics, his response carried unusual influence. Instead of backing away, 50 Cent leaned into it. He publicly reacted to Bond's statements with a tone that suggested confirmation rather than surprise. He implied that the documentary didn't invent narratives, but rather compiled accounts that were already known within industry circles. His response framed Bonds not as a disgruntled former employee, but as someone finally speaking openly. This mattered because one of the central criticisms of the documentary was bias. Diddy's camp described it as a hit piece, questioning its credibility and accusing Netflix and 50 Cent of exploiting allegations for entertainment. But Roger Bonds' reaction complicated that defense. Bonds didn't appear to be reacting for publicity. His statement suggested familiarity with the behavior being discussed. When 50 Cent amplified that reaction, it strengthened perception that the documentary reflected a long-standing reality, not a sudden sway. The context surrounding this is important. Diddy's public image for decades was that of a visionary mogul, a businessman who transformed hip-hop into a global industry. Allegations of abuse and control existed long before the documentary, but they were often treated as rumors or isolated claims. The Netflix project gathered those claims into a single narrative, adding interviews, archive footage, and testimony. Roger Bonds' reaction served as validation in the eyes of many viewers, because it came from someone who wasn't positioned as an enemy until after his time working alongside Diddy ended. 50 Cent's response also reflected a broader shift in how he has approached his commentary in recent years. In the past, his public statements about rivals often came across as trolling or entertainment. This time, the tone was different. He framed his reaction in terms of truth, patterns, and accountability. He suggested that people were uncomfortable not because the documentary lied, but because it forced conversations that had been avoided for too long. By responding to Bond's reaction rather than attacking Diddy directly, 50 Cent positioned himself as supporting testimony rather than manufacturing it. The response ignited strong reactions across hip-hop. Fans were divided. Some applauded 50 Cent for backing individuals who spoke out, arguing that powerful figures should not be immune from scrutiny. Others accused him of orchestrating a narrative designed to damage Diddy's legacy. The presence of Roger Bonds in the discussion made it harder to dismiss everything as personal beef. The conversation expanded beyond rivalry into questions about who controls history and who gets believed when powerful empires are challenged. What also intensified the situation is the timing. Diddy was already facing serious legal and reputational issues when the documentary surfaced. The response from a former bodyguard added pressure at a moment when silence would have served Diddy better. Each reaction, each public statement, fueled another cycle of scrutiny. 50 Cent's reaction to Bonds wasn't loud or aggressive. It was calculated. It implied that what viewers were seeing was only part of a much longer story. By the end of the first wave of reactions, the narrative had shifted. The documentary was no longer just a Netflix release. It became a catalyst. Roger Bond's reaction gave it credibility. 50 Cent's response gave it reach. And together, they forced the industry to confront uncomfortable questions about loyalty, power, and accountability at the highest level of hip-hop. What began as a documentary quickly evolved into a public reckoning that neither side could fully control. As the discussion spread beyond social media and into mainstream conversation, the impact of 50 Cent's response became clearer. His reaction to Roger Bonds wasn't framed as shock or curiosity. It was framed as acknowledgement. By reinforcing Bond's statements instead of distancing himself from them, 50 Cent subtly suggested that the documentary was not revealing anything new to people inside the industry. In his view, it was bringing private knowledge into public view. That distinction mattered. It changed the conversation from, "Is this true?" to "Why is this only being addressed now?" Diddy's camp responded forcefully. Lawyers and representatives dismissed the documentary as misleading, arguing that former employees like Bonds were unreliable and motivated by resentment or relevance. They labeled the project a coordinated attack, pointing to 50 Cent's long-standing animosity as proof of bias. However, that strategy had limits. Once someone like Roger Bonds spoke publicly, the argument that every critical voice was an outsider or opportunist became harder to maintain. Bonds wasn't a blogger or rival executive. He was a former bodyguard whose role required proximity and discretion, not publicity. This is where 50 Cent's response gained strategic weight. Instead of turning the situation into a personal feud, he shifted focus toward patterns. He reminded audiences that allegations against Diddy didn't begin with a documentary and wouldn't end with it. His commentary suggested that the industry had operated on unspoken rules for decades, where silence was rewarded and speaking out came with consequences. By amplifying Bonds rather than centering himself, 50 Cent positioned his role as facilitator rather than aggressor. The reaction inside hip-hop reflected a deeper anxiety. Many artists from the same era understood exactly what the situation represented. The rise of moguls, the consolidation of power, and the shift from street ethics to corporate control left many contributors without ownership or protection. When someone like Roger Bonds confirmed controlling or abusive behavior, it doesn't just implicate one individual. It forces uncomfortable reflections about how success was built and who was hurt along the way. That is why reactions have been so intense and divided. Another reason the situation carries weight is timing. The documentary didn't appear in a vacuum. Diddy was already facing lawsuits, distancing by brands, and a visible decline in support from former allies. Roger Bonds' reaction added pressure at a moment when Diddy's ability to deflect criticism was already weakened. 50 Cent's response capitalized on that moment. He didn't escalate emotionally. He let the timing do the work. By treating Bond comments as confirmation, he strengthened the argument that this wasn't about rivalry, but exposure. The public has also begun reassessing 50 Cent's role. For years, many saw his commentary as trolling, a mix of humor and provocation that blurred seriousness. This time, his response carried a different tone. It wasn't playful. It wasn't exaggerated. It was controlled. That shift led some to reconsider him not just as a rival, but as someone who had been signaling concerns long before they were widely accepted. Whether intentional or not, this reframing works in his favor. For Diddy, the situation represents a collapse of the protective layer that fame and influence once provided. When insiders begin to validate claims, public trust erodes quickly. No amount of branding or legacy can fully shield against that erosion. Each response meant to dismiss the documentary only brought more attention to it. Each attempt to discredit Roger Bonds risked reinforcing perception that uncomfortable truths were being avoided rather than addressed. What's unfolding now is bigger than any single response. It's a shift in how power is challenged within hip-hop. For decades, hierarchy discouraged confrontation. Speaking out often meant losing access, opportunities, or protection. The reaction from Roger Bonds, and 50 Cent's amplification of it, shows that dynamic changing. Silence is no longer guaranteed. Loyalty is no longer automatic. And the industry is being forced to confront stories it once buried. The long-term impact remains uncertain. More insiders could come forward, strengthening the credibility of the documentary's claims. Legal action could expand or collapse depending on evidence and proceedings. Public opinion may continue shifting as new information emerges. What is clear is that this moment cannot be undone. Once former insiders speak and powerful figures publicly validate them, the narrative changes permanently. 50 Cent's response to Roger Bonds wasn't just a comment on a reaction to a documentary. It was a signal that the era of quiet compliance may be ending, and that even the most protected figures can face scrutiny when enough voices align. Whether seen as justice or opportunism, the impact is undeniable. This exchange has forced the industry to confront questions it can no longer ignore. At its core, this story is about credibility. Roger Bonds brought proximity. The documentary brought structure. And 50 Cent brought amplification. Together, they shifted the conversation from speculation to confrontation. And once that shift happens, there's no easy way back to silence.